Sebastian Locke woke each morning in the same $30 million apartment, with the same spectacular view over Central Park, and felt the same deep emptiness that no amount of money could fill. He was a master of the financial universe, a man whose name made chief executive officers tremble and whose investments could build or destroy corporate empires. But inside the tailored Italian suit and behind the calculating eyes lived a ghost. Elena's ghost, his wife, who had left 5 years earlier, taking with her all the light in his world. He did not cry in public. Sebastian Locke never cried, but every night he sat in the leather chair in his study, held her photograph, and fought the same silent battle against an invisible enemy, guilt. Guilt for not being at her side at the end. Guilt for choosing a billion-dollar merger over the last breaths of the woman he loved. He had bought the best doctors, the most expensive clinics, the most advanced treatments, but he had not bought his own time, his own presence. And that was a debt no profit could repay. His routine was a meticulous charade. He woke at 5:17 in the morning, without an alarm. A cup of black coffee made by a cook he barely greeted. 1 hour of market data on liquid crystal screens. His empire, Locke Holdings, was a money machine as perfect and impersonal as a Swiss watch. He did not build dreams, he bought and sold pieces of other people's dreams, taking companies apart the way one dismantles toys to sell the parts. His employees feared him. His peers respected him out of fear. His friends were strategic connections. By every external measure, he was a resounding success. By every internal measure, a desert. The change began on an ordinary Tuesday, with the torrential rain that turned Manhattan streets into warped mirrors. Inside his silent limousine, on the way to another lifeless business dinner, Sebastian looked out the window and saw a scene that made his heart, hardened by the ice of routine, twist with a strange, painful jolt. A man, not much older than 30, sat on a soaked doorstep, curled against the cold. His shoulders shook, but not from the cold. He cried in a silent, devastating way, tears mixing with the rain on his face. In his hands he held a tablet, and on the screen, faded by moisture, was a photograph of a smiling woman. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. That man, with pain so bare and exposed, embodied everything Sebastian had forced himself not to be. It was his own pain, his own loss, made flesh there on the sidewalk for the whole world to see. Without thinking, driven by an impulse he himself did not understand, Sebastian ordered the driver to stop. The door opened, and the cacophony of the city shattered the bubble of silence. He stepped out, feeling the cold rain strike his cashmere suit, and walked to the man. He did not say a word. He simply took off the expensive coat, an item worth more than the man's monthly salary, and set it over the trembling shoulders. The man looked up, his eyes red and swollen, meeting Sebastian's. There was no gratitude in that look, only a raw recognition of shared pain. Sebastian did not wait for a thank you. He returned to the car, and left, abandoning the coat and a small piece of his own armor. The next morning at the office, the image of the man in the rain did not leave him. He was reviewing the reports for an imminent acquisition, a family department store chain that would be broken apart, resulting in the dismissal of 2,000 employees, when the truth landed. For the first time, he did not see only numbers, balance sheets, and synergies. He saw people. Mothers and fathers who, like the man in the rain, would have their world shattered by a decision made from an office with a view of the park. the usual coldness gave way to a sudden nausea. He canceled the meeting, to his team's astonishment, and asked for the company's full dossier, focusing not on assets but on human resources. He wanted to see the faces behind the numbers. That was how he met, even if only on paper, Mrs. Edna, who had worked the register for 40 years and was 3 years from retirement. And Charles, the young man who hauled boxes in the stockroom and dreamed of attending night college. Each story was a small beacon, lighting the darkness of his own existence. That night, instead of reviewing spreadsheets, he sat in his study and wrote a simple email to his chief operating officer: suspend the acquisition of family stores. Find a way to restructure, not demolish. Keep the jobs. It was a small step, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of his finances. But for the first time in 5 years, when Sebastian Locke took Elena's photo before sleep, he felt not only the crushing weight of guilt. He felt a stir, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of something that resembled peace. The decision to save family stores did not draw applause or understanding. On the contrary, it triggered a silent earthquake in the corridors of Locke Holdings. Sebastian faced the incredulous stares of his directors, the calculated coldness of his partners, and the backstage whispers that questioned his sanity. Sentimentality was the cardinal sin in finance, and Sebastian had committed it brazenly. He, who had always been the very embodiment of impersonal reason, was now viewed with suspicion. But for the first time in his life, he did not care what others thought. Something different burned in his spirit, a spark reborn after years of lethargy, and it flared with a force that surprised even him. The restructuring of family stores became his new obsession. He did not delegate. He plunged into the numbers himself, not to squeeze maximum profit, but to find a way to sustain the company and its people. He spent sleepless nights studying alternative business models, lean supply chains, and loyalty programs that valued both customer and employee. During one of those nights, while reviewing the file of a worker slated for termination, he found the story of Mary Lopez. Mary was an undocumented immigrant, a single mother of 2, who had worked as a night janitor at the company for 15 years. Her file was marked for immediate dismissal without any benefits, a detail that would have gone unnoticed in a standard dismantling. Sebastian could not ignore it. The next morning, he did not summon Mary to his boardroom. He went down to the building's basement where she worked alone at 3 in the morning. The woman's shock at seeing the billionaire owner of the holding company at her workplace was palpable. He found her scrubbing a restroom floor, calloused hands gripping the mop with a dignity that took his breath away. He sat on an overturned bucket and asked, simply, "Tell me about your life, Mary." And she did. She spoke of crossing the desert, of raising her children alone, of the constant fear of deportation, of the pain of watching her eldest, a brilliant student, refuse a scholarship because he had no social security number. Sebastian listened without interrupting, and each word pierced his bubble of privilege. That woman, invisible to the system he had so fiercely defended, carried a fortress of resilience he, with all his wealth, had never possessed. That very morning, he not only secured Mary's job, but assigned one of his personal attorneys to discreetly and illegally regularize her immigration status. He paid out of pocket, without anyone knowing. It was his first truly clandestine act of rebellion against the system he belonged to. What followed was not pride, but a strange, profound quiet. It felt as if a small portion of the infinite debt he carried had been paid. The episode set a new routine in motion. Sebastian began to wander the city outside business hours. He frequented cafes in poor neighborhoods, rode the subway, visited shelters and community centers, not as a tourist of poverty but as a silent student of the human condition. He observed, he listened, and he mentally recorded the struggles of ordinary people. The elderly woman choosing between medicine and food. The father sleeping in his car so his children would not wake to the shame of eviction. The young woman leaving school to care for younger siblings. Each story was a thread weaving a complex tapestry of suffering that his wealth had shielded him from all his life. During one of these wanderings, in a public park in Brooklyn, he met Pastor David, a middle-aged man with a tired but genuine smile who ran a small community soup kitchen. Sebastian, in jeans and a plain jacket, sat on a bench and began ladling soup. Pastor David did not recognize him. They talked. The pastor spoke about the poverty of the soul he saw in the city, a poverty beyond lack of money, lack of hope, connection, purpose. For the first time, Sebastian felt he was speaking to someone who understood his own illness without knowing his name. Sometimes, the cure for your own darkness is to become a light for the darkness of others, the pastor said casually, passing a piece of bread to a homeless man. The phrase echoed in Sebastian's mind like a gong. He was not religious, but he was beginning to live that truth in his own flesh. Inspired, he began to act more systematically but anonymously. He created a network of intermediaries, lawyers, social workers, Pastor David himself, through whom he funneled his money. He paid hospital bills for anonymous families. He covered the back rent of an entire building in the Bronx, preventing the eviction of 50 families. He funded full scholarships for talented students from underserved communities. It was all done in absolute secrecy. His only record was a black-covered notebook where he wrote not the amount donated but the names of people and the need met. It was his reparation list, a secret antidote to his internal poison. Still, the world had not changed. Locke Holdings was still a profit machine, and Sebastian was still its master. He was constantly torn between the brutal demands of his empire and the new purpose he had discovered. In one especially tense meeting with a vulture fund pushing for mass layoffs at a steel mill, Sebastian looked at the hard faces around the table and saw not colleagues but aliens. He was becoming a foreigner in his own life. The duality was exhausting. By day, he was Wall Street's predator. By night, the clandestine guardian angel. The breaking point came when one of his intermediaries, an attorney named Arthur, was approached by an investigative journalist. Someone was connecting the dots between anonymous payments and Locke Holdings. The risk of exposure was real. Sebastian could be accused of tax evasion, money laundering, a multitude of crimes. His partners, if they found out, would expel him without a second thought. He found himself in a blind alley. Protecting his secret meant protecting his ability to help, but it also meant continuing to live a lie. He went to Pastor David's small office under a cold drizzle. "What if the good you do must be hidden to exist?" he asked, without ceremony. The pastor looked at him, and for the first time Sebastian felt the man seeing beyond the facade. Some seeds need to sprout in darkness before they see the sun, son. The question is not whether you will be discovered, but whether you are prepared to pay the price when the light arrives. That night, Sebastian did not review spreadsheets. He sat in his study and looked at the city through the window. The glittering lights were like the thousands of lives he was secretly touching. He opened his black notebook. There were dozens of names now. Mary Lopez and her son, who now had a scholarship. Mrs. Edna, retired with dignity. Families who still had a roof over their heads. The emptiness inside him was still there, but it was no longer silent. It was filled with the echo of those stories. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The question was not whether he would continue, but how he could do more, go deeper, without being destroyed by the very system that fueled his ability to act. The night was dark, but for the first time, Sebastian Locke was not afraid of the dark. He was learning to navigate it. Autumn in New York arrived with a cutting wind that swept dead leaves along the avenues, carrying an omen of change. Sebastian Locke had become a man split in two. By day, his face was a granite mask, commanding meetings where words like cost-cutting and profit maximization cracked like gunfire across a battlefield. But at night, when the city slept, he plunged into his parallel world, the universe of silent despair and clandestine redemption. His black notebook, now with more than 100 names, was his private Bible, a mute testimony to the conflict consuming his soul. The tension reached its peak on a night of violent storm. Sebastian was in his office, forcing himself through the details of a hostile takeover that would crush a small medical prosthetics manufacturer in the Midwest, when his discreet phone rang. It was Arthur, the lawyer, and his voice carried a contained panic. "It is Michael, Sebastian. Carmen's son, the woman from the shelter in Queens. He is worse. The doctors say he needs the heart surgery now," or Arthur's voice dissolved into static, but Sebastian already knew the rest. Michael was 7, with Elena's same mischievous smile, and a congenital heart defect the public health system had ignored for years. Sebastian had promised to fund the surgery, but bureaucracy and the lack of beds in private hospitals had built a wall of time, and Michael's time was running out. Without hesitation, Sebastian abandoned the piles of takeover documents. He did not call his driver. He took his own car, a discreet Aston Martin, and dived into the torrent, driving like a madman toward the public hospital in Queens. Water hammered the windshield like tears from the sky, and every red light was agony. When he arrived, the scene was chaos and despair. The pediatric corridor overflowed with crying children, exhausted mothers leaning against walls. In the middle of that hell, he found Carmen. She knelt on the dirty floor, clutching Michael's pale hand as he struggled to breathe on a hallway gurney. Her eyes, when they met Sebastian's, did not ask for help. They had already given up on it. "They said there is no bed in the intensive care unit," Carmen whispered, her voice a snapped thread of hope. "They said, maybe next week." Sebastian looked at Michael's face, so small and fragile against the white sheets, and something inside him broke. It was not only compassion, it was a visceral recognition, a pain that echoed his own loss. He saw Elena in that bed. He saw every what-if that haunted him materialized in that child on the edge of death. Melodrama reached its crest. Sebastian, the impassive billionaire, fell to his knees beside the desolate mother. He took Michael's other hand, feeling the boy's weak, erratic pulse against his fingers. "This will not happen," he said, his voice raw, a promise made to Carmen and to the ghosts of his past. "He will live." What followed was frantic and emotionally draining. Sebastian used his phone not as a chief executive officer, but as a warrior in a sacred battle. He did not call corporate contacts, He dialed renowned cardiac surgeons he knew from charity dinners, pleading, not commanding. He offered his private jet to fetch a specialized team from Boston. He secured, with his signature on a blank check, the immediate release of an operating room at an elite private hospital. While the storm raged outside, Sebastian Locke, the man who controlled markets, was now charting the logistics of a miracle, sweating and trembling in a public hospital hallway, his impenetrable image shattered. Michael's transfer felt surreal. An ambulance, followed by Sebastian's Aston Martin, cut through the rain, a convoy of hope in the chaos. Carmen, seated beside her son, looked at Sebastian with a mix of disbelief and devotion. He was no longer a rich stranger, he was flesh and blood angel, a beacon in her darkest night. As Michael entered surgery, Sebastian waited. He waited in the empty, luxurious waiting room, his expensive clothes still wet with rain, and, he realized, with Carmen's tears that had fallen on his shoulder. The hours crawled. Each minute was torture, a replay of that night years ago when he waited for news of Elena in an airport, powerless. This time, he was present. He felt every second of the ordeal, and it devoured him alive. He prayed, something he had not done since childhood, promising everything and nothing at once. When the surgeon finally emerged, face tired but serene, and said the words, "It was a success. Michael will be fine," Sebastian did not celebrate. He collapsed into a chair, his whole body trembling, the tears he had damned for a decade breaking at last. He cried for Michael, for Carmen, for Elena, for all he had not saved, and for himself. It was a deep, purifying sob that washed the ash from his soul. At dawn, he took Carmen to see Michael, who slept peacefully in the intensive care unit, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, strong rhythm. Carmen took Sebastian's hand and pressed it, wordless. Her look said everything. In that moment, Sebastian understood the true price of the light he was trying to kindle. It was not the money, it was not the risk. It was pain. It was the courage to open fully to another's suffering and let it transform him, break him, and remake him. He left the hospital with the sunrise, the city rinsed clean by the rain. The air smelled of renewal. Sebastian Locke was no longer the same man. The battle between Wall Street predator and clandestine guardian angel had a winner. He took out his phone and canceled the hostile acquisition of the prosthetics manufacturer. He no longer cared about the consequences. Pain had claimed him, and in that pain he had finally found not a cure for his guilt, but a reason to carry it with dignity. The morning light caught his eyes, still red and swollen, but now, for the first time in years, truly alive. The dawn after Michael's surgery brought not only daylight but the hard clarity of reality. Sebastian Locke had been reborn in that waiting room, but the world around him remained the same. As he drove back to his apartment, soul rinsed by tears, his corporate phone began to vibrate without stopping. Dozens of emails and messages from partners and directors demanded explanations for the abrupt cancellation of the prosthetics takeover. The market had already reacted. Locke Holdings shares were falling in pre-market trading. The sentimentalist, as they now called him in the shadows, was weakening, and the vultures smelled blood. The duality that had been internal conflict became open, visceral war. Sebastian dressed for work with his usual precision, but the knot of his tie felt like a noose. On entering the boardroom on the 60th floor, he faced a wall of frosted faces. His principal partner, Charles Whitmore, a man of legendary coldness, led the attack. You are burning down everything we built on a whim, Sebastian. These detours into charity are costing us credibility. And credibility, my dear, is the only currency that truly matters. Sebastian looked at Charles and saw not a colleague but the embodiment of all he had been. And he felt disgust. But the war was not only at the office. His anonymity was starting to crack. An investigative reporter from the Financial Chronicle, a persistent young man named Ben Carter, had connected the dots between anonymous donations to hospitals and Sebastian's sudden change in behavior. Carter planted himself at the entrance to Locke Holdings, waiting for a statement. Inside his sanctuary, the black notebook now had its own safe, but Sebastian felt that his bulletproof glass walls were in truth a gilded prison under siege. Then tragedy, cruel and ironic, knocked on his door. A call from Pastor David. The pastor's voice, usually so calm, was broken. The community soup kitchen Sebastian secretly funded, the place where it all began, had been set on fire the night before. Suspicion fell on coordinated action by real estate interests coveting the land. There were no serious injuries, but the kitchen, the food stocks, everything was ash. They did not just burn a building, Sebastian, the pastor said, sadness echoing in the silence. They burned the hope of hundreds. Sebastian went to the site. The smell of smoke and despair still hung in the air. He saw the elderly who depended on that daily meal weeping before the ruins. He saw Pastor David standing amid the wreckage, his shoulders bowed under a weight greater than the physical. And across the street, he saw Ben Carter's car. The perfect crossroads, his corporate world pressing him to be ruthless, his humanitarian world destroyed before his eyes, and the threat of exposure hovering over it all. Emotion took him completely. He did not think about strategy, image damage, shareholders. He walked to the middle of the street, beneath the gaze of dozens of shattered people, and addressed Pastor David, but his voice carried for all to hear. "This will be rebuilt," he declared. It was not the voice of a chief executive officer, but of a common man full of conviction. Not only rebuilt, but bigger. With dormitories, with job training classes, with a clinic. And I, Sebastian Locke, personally, will make sure of it. It was his public declaration of war on his former life. Ben Carter scribbled furiously, a triumphant smile on his lips. The news spread like lightning. Wall Street shark adopts social cause. In financial forums, it was the day's punchline, a hilarious scandal. To the people on that street, he was a messiah in a suit. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Back at the office, Charles Whitmore and the board demanded his resignation. "You have stained the brand, Sebastian. You have become a risk." He faced an ultimatum: undo his public promise, return to rational profitability, or be removed by force. At the same time, exposure brought another problem. His private phone flooded with thousands of pleas for help. Desperate families, people with rare illnesses, everyone now knew his name and saw him as a lifeline. He was no longer a secret angel, he was a beacon, and every drifting ship aimed for him. The pressure was unbearable. One night, he found himself drinking neat whiskey in his office, staring at a city that now saw him as a madman or a saint. He looked at Elena's photo. "What do I do, my love?" he whispered into the void. "Save my fortune and abandon them all, or embrace this madness and lose everything I built?" Then came the most unexpected visitor. Mary Lopez, the janitor he had helped, appeared at Locke Holdings' reception. She had taken 3 trains and a bus to get there. He received her, and she brought no request. She brought a simple pot of homemade soup. "Pastor David said you were carrying the world alone," she said, her serious eyes fixed on his. "No one can carry the world alone, Mr. Locke. But many can carry a piece. My community knows what you did. We have your back." That simple gift of soup, an act of care returned, broke Sebastian. It was the most melodramatic, powerful moment of all. He realized that by exposing himself, he was not only becoming vulnerable, he was building a new community, a new family. The fortune he had amassed was not his true wealth. His true wealth was that quiet network of gratitude and mutual support. The next morning, he entered the boardroom for the last time. Instead of a suit, he wore a plain shirt. He had not come to fight. He had come to surrender to his new truth. "I do not ask you to understand," he said, his voice calm but unshakable. "I only ask that you accept my resignation. I will not bargain my soul for numbers on a screen. There is a city out there full of Marys, Carmens, and Michaels. And that is the only acquisition that matters to me now." He left the building for the last time, without a non-disclosure agreement, without $1 million exit package. Ben Carter was waiting. "What will you do now, Mr. Locke?" the reporter asked. Sebastian looked into the morning sun, for the first time without a corporate destination. "I will learn," he said, a genuine, tired smile on his lips. "I will learn to be a human being." He was no longer a billionaire in an ivory tower. He was a man on the street, with a black notebook full of names and a heart finally whole, ready for the much harder, more meaningful battle ahead. The fall of the Sebastian Locke empire was, in truth, his greatest ascent. The fall of Sebastian Locke's financial empire was reported with cruel headlines and condescending analysis. The billionaire who went soft-hearted and crazy, from master of the universe to amateur philanthropist. To the world he had left behind, his resignation was a pathetic epilogue to a brilliant career. But for Sebastian, those first days of freedom were the most terrifying and electric of his life. For the first time since Elena's death, he woke without a business plan, without a meeting to command, without a mask to hold up. The silence in his golden apartment was no longer empty, it was a space of possibility, filled with the soft echo of voices of those who now depended on him in a completely new, frightening way. Reality, however, arrived fast and hard. Without the structure of Locke Holdings, his aid work became viscerally personal and logistically chaotic. The promise to rebuild Pastor David's soup kitchen ran into a wall of city permits, wary suppliers, and the discovery that his name, once a golden pass, was now a kind of plague in circles of power. The same politicians who had courted his campaign money now avoided him, afraid to be linked to a renegade. He was learning, the hard way, that the system he had profited from was designed to keep outsiders exactly where they were. At that fragile moment, the community he had sworn to help became his true stronghold. Mary Lopez arrived at the charred site with a team of volunteers, her cousins, her neighbors, people from the block Sebastian had never met. "We know how to build, Mr. Locke," she said, with a determination that warmed his heart. "You supply the materials, we supply the sweat." And so Sebastian, the former master of the financial universe, spent his days hauling cement bags, raising drywall, learning to lay brick under a hard sun. His hands, once used only to hold Mont Blanc pens, were now rough and blistered. he had never felt more fulfilled. Pastor David became his unofficial spiritual guide. In long evening talks at the worksite, lit by floodlights, the pastor helped him channel his energy and resources more wisely and less impulsively. Charity is a bandage, Sebastian. Social justice is the cure. You must stop only putting out fires and start preventing them. Inspired, Sebastian turned his analytic mind not to breaking companies apart but to building sustainable support networks. He founded, with his own money, the Elena Foundation, named with a knot in his throat, focused on 3 pillars: emergency education, preventive health, and microcredit for small businesses in underserved communities. The past, however, did not release him easily. Charles Whitmore, his former partner, waged a silent war. Using political influence, he sabotaged the foundation's licensing and spread rumors in the markets that Sebastian was unstable and that his foundation was a front for money laundering. The conflict peaked when a principal donor to the Elena Foundation, spooked by the whispers, withdrew support, threatening to collapse the construction of the new community center. Sebastian faced the greatest crisis of his new life. He could sue Charles, plunging into an exhausting legal battle that would consume resources meant for the needy. Or he could swallow his pride and seek another path. Ben Carter, the reporter who had once hounded him, handed him the key. Carter, who watched his transformation with skepticism giving way to admiration, delivered a dossier. Whitmore is not clean, Sebastian. He has skeletons. Tax fraud and offshore havens. You could bury him. Sebastian looked at the folder, feeling the old predator stir, the urge to crush an enemy. He spent a sleepless night with the dossier in one hand and Elena's notebook in the other. Using Whitmore's dirty weapon would mean returning to the game he had sworn to abandon. It would stain the fragile purity of his new mission. By dawn, he had his answer. He would not use the dossier. Instead, he called an improvised press conference at the worksite. Standing there, boots caked with mud and a hard hat on, he spoke not as a billionaire, but as a builder. Some say I lost my mind. Others, that I lost my fortune. They are wrong. I found my soul. And today, I liquidated the last of my remaining assets, my jets, my yachts, my luxury apartments, to permanently endow the Elena Foundation. We no longer need hesitant donors. And we do not fear threats. The light we are kindling here cannot be blown out by Wall Street winds. The announcement was an earthquake. Sebastian Locke was no longer an eccentric rich man. He was a man who had burned his ships for good. The story was too powerful, too human. The media that once mocked him now celebrated him as a beacon of hope. Public pressure turned against Charles Whitmore, whose businesses began to face boycotts. The community, seeing Sebastian's total sacrifice, doubled its effort. The community center bearing Elena's name rose not in months but in weeks, a monument of sweat and solidarity. On inauguration night, with the center bright and full of life, Sebastian stood alone for a moment on the roof. He looked at the city, no longer from above but from within. The emptiness that had haunted him for a decade had been filled. Not with perfect happiness, the shadow of Elena and the world's pain were constant companions, but with purpose. A purpose that hurt, that demanded everything, but that was worth every tear, every blister, every sleepless night. He opened his black notebook. On the last page he wrote, "Dear Elena, I finally learned how to measure wealth. Not by what we gather, but by what we plant." And today, we harvested our first garden. He was no longer Sebastian Locke, the billionaire. He was Sebastian, the gardener. And his work had barely begun. The world was vast, and pain was infinite. But he finally had the right tools to face it. The Elena Community Center was a beacon of hope on a sea of need, but Sebastian soon discovered that even the greatest beacon cannot light all darkness. Success brought a heavier burden. He was no longer only the steward of his own foundation, he had become the symbol of a much larger struggle, and those who felt crushed by the same system he once fed came to him like pilgrims seeking a miracle. His life turned into an endless succession of meetings, desperate pleas, and short nights, each unanswered story a new stab to his conscience. The true crisis arrived with a family brought to him by Ben Carter, now an ally. The Oliveira family, a mother, Lucy, and her 10-year-old son, Matthew, who suffered from a rare degenerative disease. The medication that could slow the progression was produced by a large pharmaceutical corporation, Pharmax, which kept the price prohibitively high. Lucy, an undocumented immigrant, worked as a cleaner and could not afford it. Without the treatment, Matthew would lose mobility within months. Sebastian moved heaven and earth. He offered to buy the drug directly, paid for the best specialists, but collided with a bureaucratic and legal wall. Pharmax, on a market principle, refused to sell outside regular channels, even with a blank check. Sebastian discovered then that Pharmax was controlled by an investment fund in which Locke Holdings, under Charles Whitmore, was the majority shareholder. The monster he had helped create now tightened the noose on his new life, using an innocent child's fate as a weapon. Melodrama surged to its zenith on a rainy night when Sebastian visited Lucy and Matthew in their small Brooklyn apartment. The boy, confined to an improvised bed in the corner, could barely hold a pencil to draw. Lucy, eyes hollow with exhaustion and despair, held Sebastian's hand. They said, "There is nothing to be done, Mr. Locke. That it is the law of the market." The phrase echoed in Sebastian's mind as the cruelest absurdity. The law of the market against the law of compassion. He looked at Matthew and saw, once more, the face of every Michael the world insisted on sacrificing at the altar of profit. That night, Sebastian did not sleep. In his study, he faced the final crossroads of his journey. He had given away his fortune, but not all his power. He still held one weapon: shares and insider knowledge of dozens of companies, remnants of his previous life. He could use that knowledge to manipulate the market, to attack Pharmax and force it to yield, but that would mean dirtying his hands with the predatory tactics he now rejected. It would betray everything the Elena Foundation stood for. The other option was to accept defeat and watch Matthew's slow decline. A moral sacrifice of another human being. The tension became physical, a pain in his chest that accompanied every breath. He opened the black notebook, now with hundreds of names, and turned to the first page, where Elena's photo was pasted. "What is right, my love?" he asked aloud, tears falling on the picture. "To save a life using the enemy's weapons, or keep my hands clean and carry the weight of a death?" By dawn, he had his answer. It would not be one or the other. He would do both. He would turn the system against itself, and pay the full price. Sebastian gathered all confidential documents he still possessed, emails, internal reports, market strategies, and handed them to Ben Carter. "This is the key to bringing Pharmax down. It shows price collusion, bribes to regulators. But publishing this is a crime. I will be indicted." Ben hesitated. "Sebastian, this will destroy you. You could go to prison." Sebastian smiled, sad and serene. "Some seeds must be buried in darkness to bloom. Let mine be one of them." The story exploded. Pharmax's share price plunged. Public and legal pressure became so overwhelming that the company, within days, announced lifetime medication for Matthew and hundreds of other patients in similar situations. It was a resounding victory, a miracle wrested with a lion's claws. But the law claimed its price. Sebastian was arrested at his modest home, before the horrified eyes of the community he had helped build. The scene was piercing melodrama, children crying, women on their knees, Pastor David reading psalms. Sebastian, calm, surrendered peacefully. He was no longer a billionaire above the law. He was an ordinary man facing the consequences of his choices. In the dark cell, far from the comfort he had always known, Sebastian sat on the cold floor. The emptiness did not return. In its place was a deep, unbreakable peace. He had saved Matthew. He had exposed corruption. He had remained faithful to Elena's ghost and to his reborn conscience. The sacrifice of his freedom was the price, and he paid it willingly. Outside, the seed he had planted burst into life. The story of Sebastian Locke, the billionaire who traded everything for a cause and now faced prison, became a rallying cry. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. The hashtag Freedom for Sebastian flooded social networks. The community he had saved now rose to save him. Lucy and Matthew told their story on camera. Mary Lopez organized a vigil of thousands of candles. Pastor David mobilized faith leaders of every denomination. Sebastian, in his cell, heard it all from a moved guard. And he smiled. He was not alone. His fall was not the end. It was the beginning of a movement. The seed of compassion he had planted in hard soil had not only sprouted, it was bearing fruit that would feed a multitude. The darkness of the cell could not reach the light burning inside him. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in a very, very long time, slept deeply and without nightmares. The battle was far from over, but the war, he knew, was already won. The trial of Sebastian Locke was not a legal process. It was a ritual of collective purification. The courtroom, packed with faces he had helped, looked more like a congregation than a hall of justice. When the prosecutor, in a grave voice, listed the crimes: possession of confidential documents, obstruction of justice, violation of trade secrets, each charge sounded like a disguised tribute. And when the defense called its witnesses, they were not legal experts or psychologists, but the true owners of this story. Mary Lopez, hands still marked by labor, spoke of the night a billionaire descended to the basement to hear her story. Ben Carter, the reporter, showed the jury how the information Sebastian had leaked saved not one but hundreds of children like Matthew. Pastor David, Bible trembling in his hands, called it the miracle of compassion against the tyranny of numbers. And Lucy, holding Matthew's hand, now able to walk with a frame, needed few words. Her silent tears before the court said everything that had to be said. The most dramatic moment came when Sebastian himself rose to speak. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not justify his acts. He told a story, the story of a man who had everything and was nothing, and of how he discovered that the true measure of a life is not in what you gather, but in what you give. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet room, I am not here to deny the facts. I am here to affirm a greater truth. There are laws written in books, and laws written in the human heart. When they collide, a man must choose which he will honor. I made my choice, and I am at peace with it. Acquittal did not come as a surprise but as an inevitable conclusion. When not guilty echoed through the room, there were no victory shouts, only a reverent silence, followed by a single clap that swelled into a thunderous ovation. Sebastian did not smile. He only nodded, as if this were less about his freedom and more about the redemption of a society still able to tell right from wrong, the letter of the law from its spirit. Outside the courthouse, under a sun that seemed brighter, a crowd waited for him. Not journalists hungry for a headline, but the hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. There was Michael, now 11 with a strong heart, Carmen, holding flowers picked from the community garden, all the names from his black notebook, now faces of flesh and bone, forming a living mosaic of hope. In the months that followed, Sebastian did not return to his previous life. How could he? He had become something larger than a philanthropist, larger than a former billionaire. He had become a symbol. The Elena Foundation, now guided by a board that included Mary, Pastor David, and Ben Carter, expanded to other cities, always keeping Sebastian's fundamental principle that every person helped was not a number in a spreadsheet, but a sacred story. Sebastian, in turn, took on a quieter role. He spent his days at the community center not as a director but as a volunteer among many. He taught math to children, helped serve meals, listened to the stories of those who arrived without hope. His wealth was no longer in bank accounts, but in eyes that shone when a mother landed her first job, when a young person entered college, when a family found a home. On a calm afternoon, he visited Elena's grave. For the first time in years, he did not bring guilt. Instead, he brought flowers picked from the center's garden and his now complete black notebook. "They say I saved many people, my love," he whispered, touching the stone. "But the truth is they saved me. And it all began with you. It all began with the love you showed me." As he turned to leave, he saw something that made him stop. On the path behind him, dozens of community members had gathered in silence. Not to ask for anything, only to walk with him to a resting place. To show that he would never be alone again. The epilogue of this story is not a grand deed, but the daily miracles. Sebastian Locke did not change the world, but he changed his corner of it. And in that corner, gardens bloomed where there had only been concrete. His story became a beacon not because he was a hero, but because he was profoundly human. In the end, that fragile, imperfect, stubborn humanity proved to be the most transformative force of all. The final image shows him sitting on the steps of the community center at sunset, surrounded by laughing children while he fixes an old bicycle. On his face, there is peace. In his hands, the marks of honest work. And in his heart, the quiet certainty that, at last, after a lifetime, he learned the only answer that truly mattered. It is not how much we have that defines our wealth, but how much of ourselves we give. And in that economy of love, Sebastian Locke discovered he was truly a billionaire.